everyone, my name is Taso, Pappas, and I'm so excited to be back with you guys in our next installment so that we can talk about the most amazing gospel. You know, the word gospel means good news, and God always has good news for us. Any promise that God has ever made, anything that He's spoken about Himself, anything that He's spoken about life is always good news. And remember, Jesus came to give us the abundant life. So I'm going to carry on from our last installment, and that was concerning the gospel of peace. You know, there is a gospel of peace that you might have never heard of, and it's found in Isaiah 53 and 54. And you need to know the gospel of peace. You need to establish and root your life in this gospel of peace, the covenant of peace, which is the new covenant. It's the covenant that God made with Jesus, so that you now can participate in His inheritance, in what He has accomplished, and it can be yours for free. For free. That's why, you know, I don't know if you've ever heard the free gift of righteousness. It's free. You accept it simply by faith, and it becomes yours once you engage with that reality. So today, I'm going to, this week, this installment, the next installment, I'm going to talk to you about the gospel of peace. I'm going to go verse by verse on Isaiah 53, and the next installment I will do Isaiah 54. So let's, without any delay, let's go to Isaiah 53. I'll be reading from the King James Version. And verse 1, it says, "Who has believed our report?" Now, there is a report that man has, and there is a report that God has. Now, what we're going to read here is a report that God has, and that is the report that we need to believe. In other words, this is the point of view of how we will look at life, how we will look at ourselves, how we would look at every aspect of what life is. And we need to look at it from the report that's going to be given to us by God. Who has believed our report? And to whom is the arm, in other words, His might, His power, and His strength to deliver? Whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? It's a question mark. For He shall grow up, and He's talking about Jesus, before Him, before God, in other words, as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness, and when we see Him, there is no beauty. We find little gems here, hidden gems about Jesus. This scripture points that He had no special anointings. There was nothing special about Him, as a lot of people try to make Him out to be, because He performed miracles and He did so many things. But there was no special anointing about Him. And when we see Him, it says, there is no beauty that we should desire Him. He is despised and rejected by men. Speaking of Jesus at His crucifixion. A man of sorrows. The word sorrows means pain, calamities, chaos, sickness. And acquainted with grief. Grief is the Hebrew word there for infirmities. This was on the cross. There was no record of Him being sick in the days of His life, obviously. And we hid, as it were, our faces from Him. He was despised, and we did not esteem Him. Now look at verse 4. I love this verse here. He says, "Surely He has borne our griefs." Now, the reason Jesus became sin is because after He became sin, He had to endure all the consequences of sin. Galatians 3:13 tells us that Jesus became a curse for us. This is what we see here. And then He goes on, He says, "And He carried our sorrows." The word sorrows literally means our pains. "Yet we esteemed Him stricken." And notice this thing. Smitten by God and afflicted. The word smitten means killed in the Hebrew. He was killed by God, and He was afflicted. The word that means browbeaten. Why? Because He was wounded, in verse 5 He says, for our transgressions. He was bruised by who? Not by the Roman soldiers, not by the Jewish people. No, God did it on Him with the curses. So he put all of those things on Jesus. He was bruised for our iniquities. The word there is perversions. So verse 5 tells us that the chastisement for our peace. Now that's an amazing little word there, because the word chastisement literally means an emotional torment. Jesus was emotionally tormented on your behalf. In other words, he went through all of that emotional upheaval that you go through in life. When there is worries, when there is anxieties concerning sicknesses, finances, whatever it might be. Now, he became that. He took that. Remember, 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, he who knew no sin, in other words, he didn't know any emotional torment, became that emotional torment for you. He took it upon himself. He became that so that you might have his peace. So the chastisement for our peace that we're going to have with God came upon him, and by his stripes. Now the word stripes is the word bruising. He was bruised by God, not the Roman soldiers, as we've oftentimes hear. Not the whipping that came upon him on his back. So he's talking about the stripes or the bruising specifically that God gave, God the Father gave to Jesus. And notice, and by his stripes, he says, or by his bruising we are healed. Look at verse 6. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. But he says, and the Lord, he's talking about God, has laid or made to meet on him or in him, in Jesus, the iniquity of us all, past, present, and future, and for every generation, and for every human being that will ever exist on this earth. So we see here all mankind. That's what he's talking about. Now in verse 7 and 8, we're going to see what specifically happened to him. Now look at this. You might have never heard it this way. He was oppressed and he was afflicted. He's talking about Jesus. Yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. You see, if Jesus did open his mouth, and this is why he kept quiet, truth would come out. And if truth would come out of his heart, he would have been able to deliver himself. And that's why he kept himself quiet. That's why he did not open his mouth. Not because of the suffering and the pain that he was, well, there was obviously suffering and pain that he was experiencing, but he kept his mouth closed because if he opened it, truth would come out and he would be able to deliver himself. In verse 8, he was taken from prison and from judgment. And who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. In other words, he did that for you, not for himself. Verse 9. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich in his death. And if you look at the Hebrew, the word death is deaths. It's plural. So that means that he not only died physically, but he also died spiritually. And this is why he went to hell. And we see that in Acts 2:27. David prophesied there, and he himself says, you will not leave my soul in Hades. That's what he's saying. And he's speaking on behalf of Jesus. Then he goes on and it says here, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Now, verse 10 says, yet it pleased the Lord. Now, why did it please the Lord to bruise him? This is so important. You know, sometimes we look at this and we say, what is what could possibly make God the Father pleased when he sees his own very son suffering? God, in other words, bruised Jesus with sicknesses that our sin, mine and yours, would deserve under the law, under, the way that we were supposed to live life. So God actually was pleased. Now, why was he pleased? Because beyond what was happening to Jesus, he saw your freedom. He saw you free from sickness, from sin, from disease, from anxiety, from all of those things. That's why it pleased him. It was pleasing because he saw beyond what was happening. He saw you being totally free. Isn't that amazing? He, talking about God in verse 10, has put him to grief. In other words, Jesus to sickness. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his day, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Notice in verse 11, he is talking about God the Father, shall see the travail of his soul and be satisfied. In other words, his wrath will be satisfied. And therefore, this is how, and I'm going to tell you in our next installment, how the covenant of peace is established. By his knowledge, my righteous servant shall justify many. The many is you and me. This is what he saw beyond what Jesus was going through. For he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the great. Who's the great? You and I, the ones who come and believe in Jesus. We become part of him, and therefore we are his great. Why? Remember, we are more than conquerors. He conquered, and he became great. But guess what? The minute we accept him in our lives, then we also partake of his portion, of his inheritance, for free, as a gift. And that's how we become the great. And he shall divide the spoils with the strong. Who do you think the strong is? Where do we get our strength from? We the strong. We get our strength because we have connected to the vine, John 15:1. And we experiencing his strength. We experiencing his power, his ability, his capacity to be able to express who he is in this life. To experience, loving someone else unconditionally. Isn't that freedom? Hey, the freedom to love someone unconditionally. That is the most amazing thing that you will experience if you connect to this reality. So we are the strong that he's talking about there. But he poured out his soul unto death. And this is more than physical death, but he's talking about the realm of death. It can be emotional death, relational death. It can be death in your finances, but ultimately also includes the death of ultimate separation from God, which is hell. And he was numbered with the transgressors. Oh man. And he bore the sin of many and made intercession for their transgressors. So this is Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 simply tells us what Jesus did on our behalf, you and me. And now this paves the way in our next installment that I'm going to go verse by verse also in Isaiah 54. And that's where you establish your life. Your life is established in the covenant of peace, which is the new covenant. And this is where Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and ascension to be able to receive the inheritance that he obtained for you and me. This is what we finally see, that out of all that comes the gospel of peace.